At this point, we're going to transition to panel one. Rob Califf and Laura Esserman are standing by to lead this panel. I want to encourage the audience to send their questions as they think of them. Don't wait till the end of the panel. Just send them all throughout the panel as we'll accumulate the questions and try to get to as many as possible. Laura, Rob, turn it over to you guys.
Great. Well, thank you so much for allowing us to put this panel on. And I think that Dr. Tessier-Levine has really set us up very well, because our next panel is really about the issues and opportunities generated by accelerated approval and the idea of how confirmatory endpoints can drive evidence generation and value if handled appropriately. And we're going to explore the ways in which we can improve that process. So today we have an illustrious group ready, standing by to have this discussion. I'm joined by Dr. Robert Califf, who really needs no introduction, but Rob began his career as a cardiologist and clinical trialist, transforming the field of cardiology in the 80s and 90s with large lean trials with built-in early endpoints. And he's continued to be a leader, serving as the FDA commissioner in the last year. The Obama administration has been nominated by President Biden to be the current FDA commissioner. We are really grateful for his commitment and dedication to the field and willingness to serve, and for his passion for innovation and healthcare value. Dr. Sean Tunis has had a long and illustrious career in public policy with the goal of aligning incentives for payment to drive healthcare value. He's currently a senior fellow at Tufts Medical Center and was the former CMO at CMS, Chief Medical Officer at CMS, and former senior advisor to the Principal Deputy Commissioner at the FDA. We're also very fortunate to have Julia Beaver join us. She's had a long, illustrious career as a medical oncologist and continues to hold an appointment at Johns Hopkins in medical oncology. She has been a tireless advocate for regulatory science, and today serves as the Deputy Director of the Office of Oncologic Diseases and the Chief Medical Office, the Chief of Medical Oncology and the Oncology Center of Excellence at the FDA. Dr. Hal Barron started his career as a cardiologist and has become and continues to be an industry giant as Chief Medical Officer for Genentech, then Calico, and is bringing his acumen and appetite for innovation to the field as the Chief Medical Officer for GlaxoSmithKline. Michelle McMurry-Heath is a physician and immunologist and has had a long interest in policy, serving as the Aspen Institute's founding director of Aspen Institute's Health Biomedical Science and Society Policy Program, then served as associate director at the Center for Devices and Radiologic Health at the FDA. She became an executive at J&J and was recently appointed as president and CEO of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, BIO. And finally, we are very fortunate to have Congresswoman Anna Eshoo. She has served as Congresswoman from Silicon Valley from the 18th Congressional District and has had an illustrious career and has risen to become a leader. She currently serves as the chair of the Health Subcommittee as part of the very powerful Energy and Commerce Committee. And any ideas we come up with, I know she can put into action in terms of legislation. She's actually served on the Health Subcommittee for 14 of her 20 years in Congress. And she's recently introduced a bill to increase racial diversity in trials. Has been a great supporter of accelerating progress in the field of oncology and health in general. So with that, we're going to get started with our panel. So in 2005, Andy Grove wrote an editorial in JAMA about his insights about the healthcare industry. And he compared it to the semiconductor industry, of which he was a founder, mover, and shaker. His basic criticism was that our knowledge turns were too slow, and that we did not have a system with feedback to enable the kind of rapid continuous improvement in our field. Accelerated approval and early endpoints has recently come under quite a bit of criticism. However, these early endpoints reflect the eventual endpoints that we want to achieve: disease survival, overall survival, symptom-free survival, improved quality of life, et cetera. And they are the ways with which the scientific, medical, and regulatory industry can move more quickly in how we can provide better healthcare value to the populations. Of course, tensions have to be balanced in regulatory management, and we don't want to prevent, we want to be able to prevent people from having harm if the benefits are overstated and the harms are underestimated. But it is also true that great harm can be done by moving too slowly and not pushing forward with innovations that keep pace with advances in science and prevent suffering and disease. So this is about the balance of moving too quickly or moving too slowly. Both can lead to harm. But rather than be forced to choose, perhaps a better approach is to improve our system for learning. I think one of the reasons driving reluctance to use accelerated approval, especially with early endpoints, is that there's a big gap between accelerated approval and confirmatory evidence generation. Dr. Califf and I were discussing this as we put this panel together, and I wanted to start the panel with you, Rob, because I wanted to really echo your comment that you made during the hearings for FDA Commissioner. You said, I'm a fan of accelerated approval, but that means we've got to have a better system to evaluate these products as they're used on the market. So maybe you could start by unpacking that comment and talking about the components of the system that would allow better evaluation.
Laura, thanks. And as you know, when we were discussing this, the idea that I would even be thinking about returning to the FDA was not even in my state of consciousness. So I have to be a little bit careful about what I say at this phase of being a nominee up for a Senate vote. But it was part of the conversation with almost every senator on the Health Committee in our one-on-one meetings. And I can assure you the Congress is very eager to understand what's going on with accelerated approval, because there's such a division of views in the public domain, even among notable academics. What I meant by that comment was I do believe it's in the American ethos that people want access to potentially beneficial treatments as soon as possible. And I think there was wisdom in what's been done with accelerated approval, and that it really is reserved for situations in which there's not an effective treatment and the disease is serious. Because I also believe, as a card-carrying cardiologist, that for diseases where we have a lot of effective treatments, the standard needs to be really high, because we don't want people jumping to treatments that may or may not work in preference to treatments that are already proven to be effective. So I think the general construct, as it currently exists, I'm a fan. But, and I think I'll be very interested in the other panelists' comments about this, I think the failure to produce confirmatory evidence quickly and in a way that really gives us the information that we need as patients and clinicians to decide which treatments are most effective and in which order. The accelerated approval conundrum is only part of a much larger conundrum. And the analogy I've been using is like a relay race where the FDA runs the first lap, it gets to the end of its lap and it just drops the baton on the ground. And then somebody else, like CMS, has to figure out where the baton is, pick it up, and start all over. And I think that is not a good way to get good health. And my primary evidence is, well before COVID, we were losing life expectancy in the US and relatively at a much faster rate than the rest of the world. And so we are innovating in the US in a way that's helping the entire world, but there's something we're not doing right in implementing those innovations. So that's the way I see it. And I think this is a great panel to either show where I'm wrong or talk about how we're going to fix this next part of the issue.
Well, that is a great segue to you, Sean, as former Chief Medical Officer of CMS. When that relay race is being run, what are the tools that could be used or should be used? And the FDA, of course, can say nothing about payment, but what do you think is missing?
Yeah, well, thanks for this question. And, fortunately, I've not been nominated for anything, so I don't have to be careful at all about what I say. No, and I can definitely relate to Rob's metaphor about the baton handoff, because as, spending time at CMS and working with payers for a lot of years, I think there's this feeling of, crawling around on the ground trying to find the baton to pick up while, to keep the race going. So I want to make a couple of observations and suggestions quickly, because I know we have a lot of folks to speak on this panel. You know, the FDA has, you know, in trying to address this issue of technologies that are promising, that meet a significant unmet need, they have a lot of policy tools, a range of policy tools, you know, breakthrough pathways and accelerated approval, and, you know, a kind of a whole, what I would say, a kind of a quiver of ways of dealing with, you know, breakthrough innovations in a more efficient way. Medicare does not have a range or nuanced policy tools. Essentially, I mean, with some exceptions, but basically, you know, we have the reasonable and necessary authority to make coverage decisions. So that's the statutory authority to decide, you know, what technologies improve outcomes. But that's the only statutory authority or program that exists in the Medicare program. What we've sort of developed as an offshoot of the reasonable and necessary authority is something called coverage with evidence development, where technologies that are promising and meet an unmet need can be covered with a requirement to collect additional prospective data. But really, it's a relatively seldom used tool, and it can only be used for technologies that are so expensive, like transcatheter valve replacement, that, you know, you can build an entire infrastructure, like a registry infrastructure that the ACC operates, you know, that helps collect that data. But for the vast majority of important innovative technologies, there is no such infrastructure to help collect the data. You know, so I think that, and this is probably going to require legislation, is to look at providing CMS with some more nuanced tools for making coverage decisions for innovative technologies that perhaps, for example, would, first of all, put the coverage with evidence development program, give it a statutory basis, because it's sort of a jury-rigged, adapted authority, and perhaps allow for things like adjustable rebates based on, you know, for products where there's less evidence. But there's a whole range of potential policy tools. And the last thing, just to comment, you know, I noticed that the FDA has their Office of Chief Scientist and an Office of Regulatory Science, and there is nothing comparable at CMS. But if you expect the CMS agency to be making intelligent scientific decisions in a consistent way, I think there needs to be a program for reimbursement science that is analogous to regulatory science, that actually, you know, provides a forum for the agency to be thinking creatively about actually how to do scientifically legitimate decision making.
That is a great point. And as you know, the one source tools that were mentioned in the opening really are about an open source way to make sure that we can collect the data we need to deliver good care in the course of care that seamlessly, you know, drop into trials, but could seamlessly be used for any kind of registry or any kind of data gathering during the process of accelerated approval. You know, I think given the great controversy that we've had recently over early endpoints, I think that it's certainly true that they're not always correct, but they actually do provide this opportunity to dramatically accelerate learning. But again, if you want to move forward, you have to be able to take some kind of risk. Julia, perhaps we could have you talk next about the experience that the Oncology Center of Excellence has had with accelerated approval. I think perhaps this is the division in the FDA that has used this tool incredibly well.
Absolutely. So I think the experience of accelerated approval in oncology has really been a success. We have over 160 oncology accelerated approvals for indications, approximately half of which have confirmed benefit in a median of 3 years. And many of these therapies have been truly transformative, disease-shaping therapies, many ultimately life-prolonging, providing years of early access due to this accelerated approval pathway. You know, the remainder of the accelerated approvals that have not yet been confirmed are mostly from approvals in the last few years. with about less than 10% of our accelerated approval indications having been withdrawn either due to clinical trials, confirmatory trials not verifying benefit or not being able to be performed.
So Hal, as I believe it was your idea that you gave me to push the idea of a complete pathologic response in the setting of oncology to try and drive forward the early approvals when we were starting the I-SPY trial. And, I think we've had this conversation about, all early endpoints aren't correct, but where do you see it's really well worth taking the risk, and what do you think is lacking?
Well, thanks, Laura. I think I'm in a place very much like what Rob was saying, that I think there are diseases where surrogates have been well explored, and the probability that they're in the causal pathway is high, that the ability to determine the impact of modulating that surrogate on a clinically meaningful outcome has been well explored, such that that it might not just simply be a statistically significant increase in the surrogate, but one that will likely translate, not guaranteed, but likely translate into a clinically meaningful benefit for the right population, given both the safety profile, the unmet need, and the potential impact that if that surrogate is in the causal pathway and does what I just mentioned. And pathologic CR for in the neoadjuvant setting, like all the work you've been doing with I-SPY, I think meets all of those criteria and has translated into benefit, pretty significant benefit, I would say, in the adjuvant setting, like you and I have been talking about with pertuzumab over the last almost decade. And the ability to get pertuzumab, as an example, approved, I think it was somewhere around 2013, with the ultimate really meaningful clinical data in the adjuvant setting, probably 5 to 6, maybe something like that years later, when we had the longer term follow-up and saw the magnitude of benefit that those women experienced. And you think about all the benefit that was available to patients prior to that knowledge, was a very smart risk. And now it won't always turn out that way. As you say, the surrogates aren't as clear in some diseases. But I think there's a number of surrogates where the risk benefit for doing this accelerated approval is quite impressive and a very, very smart risk to take. I do think in terms of where it has failed, first of all, I think it's been one of the most important innovations in regulatory policy in a while, but where I think it has failed is I'm not convinced that the 3 or 4 things have been done well. First, there needs to be more rigor, I think, in the designing the conversion trials. Now, in the setting of pertuzumab, I think that was done very well. But sometimes you have the conversion trial, and you have to remember that once the FDA decides that the benefit is likely there, you lose equipoise. So you can't quite repeat the study
That's right.
as easily. So you're using different populations oftentimes that may end up confounding the interpretation. I think there needs to be a lot more rigor around these confirmatory trials, such that you believe them. When they're positive, you full approval. When they're negative, you that's it. You're done. There was a smart risk to take that was wrong.
Or build
I think
them
we
in.
need to be a little more rigorous there. I also think that we can rely more on ex-US data where the equipoise might still be there. I think we need a lot more work on timing, because some of these trials are taking an enormously long time to convert, and I don't think that that's appropriate. And so ways to improve that. I think there's been a lot of talk about using real-world evidence. I'm not convinced that that will help as much as really robust randomized trials where you really do need to see efficacy, and the real world has enormous confounding. And then lastly, I would just say that more work on validating the surrogates over time. And then, I'm sure we'll talk about this later, but the last thing I think where that's failed is it's been phenomenally effective in oncology, but I think it's been lacking. And I know this is a sensitive topic because there's been a recent one that's been very controversial, but I do think that there's plenty of diseases that are significant in terms of both unmet need, available therapies. People don't always look at the Kaplan-Meier curve for class 4 heart failure, but it looks in many respects worse than cancer. And I would love to see more accelerated approvals in diseases, whatever, lupus. There are a number of diseases where I think accelerated approval could be applied as robustly as it is in onc.
Well, and getting started down that path starts us generating the evidence, and that's what you need to prove whether your surrogate is really working as well as you think. But if you don't start down the path, then you're nowhere, right? And
right.
So, Michelle, I'm going to turn to you next and say, what, in your experience, is this an opportunity to also think about, now that we have increased the successful products, a treatment, say, in cancer, but we're also throwing in the kitchen sink. And there are all these new targeted agents that are coming up on all these small companies and various things. Isn't this the opportunity for us to start to think about, can we do less? Can we be more targeted? Should we be driving forward? What can you as a leader in industry do to try and help narrow this gap and sort of think about how to encourage the people that you lead to be thinking differently, to work with payers, to collect data? What are you thinking?
Well, Laura, thank you. And it's an incredibly important area. I think often the overall success of accelerated approval gets lost in some of the more recent controversies. We're coming on the 30th anniversary of accelerated approval. There have been 269 therapies approved through the process, and 8% of them have been withdrawn for safety or efficacy. If you compare that to normal channels of FDA approval, we have a recent study showed that there was somewhere around 5% withdrawals. So it's not that the accelerated approval bar is so much lower than our other all standards that we are presenting undue risk for patients. We have to remember we're trying to make sure that the perfect is not the enemy of the good, particularly in these healthcare settings where you have huge unmet needs, and this is particularly important. And Hal mentioned lupus in disease areas where you have a disproportionate share of racial and ethnic minorities that are impacted by the disease. So this is not the time to retreat on accelerated approval. This is the time to double down, but to also modernize our evidence collection techniques so that we can capture the evidence as quickly and as rapidly as possible. And I know Hal mentioned some skepticism about real-world data and real-world evidence, but really this is the future. We need to be able to capture in real time whether it's a product that has made it through accelerated approval or a more conventional pathway. We need to know as soon as possible and as reliably as possible whether a product is failing to perform as we expect it to perform. And that's going to take being able to capture what's happening in the actual clinical setting. And there may be confounders there, but it's actually what happens when most patients are encountering new medical products. They have confounders, they're dealing with other healthcare and life issues, and that's the data we really need to confirm whether our products are behaving as we expect.
Thank you. So, Congresswoman Eshoo, I'm going to turn to you actually now, because it sounds to me like there's a lot of appetite for wanting to do more. But in the setting where we actually have a link between approval and getting data, what do you see is the role of legislation to help promote this kind of an idea? Or is it already in the 21st Century Cures Act, or is this something that we can really work with you to truly try and think through?
Well, first of all, thank you, Dr. Esserman, for inviting me to be with all of you this morning. Sundays are, for some people, are days of prayers. I can't help but think that you all are in the process of answering the prayers of so many people across the country and really the world, because what we bring forward in the United States gives hope to people around the world. Dr. Califf, I'm looking forward to having you come back to the committee and working with you. It's an honor to be with all of you. We passed the 21st Century Cares Act in I think it was in 2016, and that legislation really brought forward so many of the regulatory changes at FDA to and the discussion that you're having this morning. The EUA was born out of that legislation. So I think that number one, we're going back at 21st Century Cures That was 1.0. Now we're working on 2.0. And I think that for anyone, for people that are listening into this, we are really very, very dependent upon what the scientific community brings forward to us. I'm not a card-carrying cardiologist. I'm a card-carrying policymaker. So we are dependent in so many ways on you and the partnerships that are actually part of CERSI to help shape the legislation. I'm picking up ideas. Sean, I'm going to go back at looking at regulatory changes for that you mentioned this morning. So I would say overall, I think that we have marvelous foundations that we have built upon, but we have to keep, we learn from what we've done, where there may be gaps, and how to create even better pathways, because people, the American people, are depending upon us to bring those changes forward, to save their lives, to improve their lives. And I think that in our day and our time, we certainly have the wherewithal. I think, the capacity to do this. It's a matter of working together to get it done so that it's targeted. And I think in 2.0 of 21st Century Cures Act, we are in the 21st century. We're in the second decade that we can build upon what we've done before.
Well, that's very encouraging. And it sounds like, so let's just say, hypothetically, that we could do, as you say, and sort of have some kind of link where, we could get that kind of follow-up data on accelerated endpoints and final endpoints. So if that were the case, for each of you, let's take it from what Anna Eshoo says. If she says she can change let's just say we can wave a wand. I know it's so simple to get legislation through. So let's just say we move this forward and you have the data. Let's think about, I don't know, Rob, whether you would comment on this, but, I think, what would you be willing to take more of a risk? Is it more appropriate? I think, Julia, you said to me yesterday, maybe that 10% is a little on the low side. If we really had a system where we could rapidly generate the data, should we be doing something different? Would we be willing to take a little bit more of a risk or change the structure of how we generate the data? Julia, I'll start with you.
Sure. So the situation and framework we're in now is that companies who receive accelerated approval conduct the confirmatory trials. And although we can't require this, we are really stressing the need for that confirmatory trial to be well underway, if not fully enrolled, at the time of the accelerated approval action to avoid this delay and gathering the confirmatory evidence of clinical benefit. But in terms of our having confidence in the ability to get that confirmatory evidence, that does even now play into our overall risk-benefit decision-making. So if we have confidence or agreement with a company up front, early agreement, that's the ideal situation on the development plan for both accelerated approval and evidence needed to be generated for confirmation, that can play into our risk-benefit decision-making for the ultimate support of that accelerated approval action. So we can take the understanding of how the confirmatory evidence will be generated into our risk-benefit decision-making.
Rob, do you think that there should be better coordination amongst the various agencies? I mean, CMS, a lot of our insurance is private sector, but so goes CMS, so goes other things. Even though the FDA doesn't have the authority, should we be thinking more broadly to make a better connection?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most important things I learned in my time at FDA is the power when the federal agencies actually do work together with common purpose. And it does relate to the relay race. I mean, remember, in a relay race, you typically have a number of yards where the second runner is running alongside the first runner, gathering steam for a smooth handoff. And we just don't have that. I do want to, when it comes to taking risks, and it really is a risk, not so much the FDA's risk, it's a risk to those that are delivering healthcare and to the patients who are affected. So, can I just comment about a couple of things that have been said already, Laura?
Of course.
And the first is just a really important point, I think, is there's nothing about the definition of real-world evidence that excludes randomization. And in fact, I sort of sit between Hal and Michelle, the way they described it. I think one of the most powerful tools we have is randomization in the real world. And one of the most powerful examples we have of why that works is the recovery trial in the UK as it relates to COVID. I mean, they just beat the socks off of the US in terms of evidence generation because they used their electronic health records. They made it routine to randomize within the healthcare system, and they got answers quickly that all of us benefited from. And then also just make the point, when you talk about taking risk, I think one of the most destructive things is to promise people that you have a benefit when it turns out you really don't. And so while I don't dispute Michelle's numbers, I think they are the numbers. It's those unknowns out there where probably a bulk of the negatives are going to reside because, and so, what I would say is that, yeah, very carefully and very specific to the circumstance, it might be more or less risk taken if you had the full range of tools that Sean brought up so that you could be assured. And I would say it ought to come first. The industry needs to come through and assure people that these studies are going to get done. And I think that the ploy of oncology, I don't know the details, but I like what Julia said. If the trials are mostly enrolled before the approval comes, then you're going to get the answer. So I think if there was confidence on the public sector that the industry was committed to get the answers, and Congresswoman helped us come up with a mechanism that made it efficient to get the studies done, everybody would win.
Yeah, and to make it easier for all, I think that's one of the things about the recovery trial. Every hospital instantly had a way to collaborate. Going hospital by hospital to get these data agreements and sort of to put these tools in place to capture data is just unbelievable. I know this because we did it as part of the iSpy COVID trial. It is onerous. It is hard. These are the kinds of infrastructure things that need to be put in place. Maybe, Sean, you can give us an example of, where you think this sort of data collection is like truly a win-win for the public. And then we can talk, maybe we can go to Hal and Michelle about, what would the industry be willing to do differently to sort of move this forward? So give us your best example, Sean.
Yeah, well, and
of a win-win of this kind of thing.
Yeah, just to say, leading up to that I think this idea of willingness to take risk in exchange for greater certainty that, meaningful evidence will be efficiently generated would definitely apply to payers, Medicare certainly, and the private payers as well. But I think a lot of reluctance about sort of open reimbursement or market access for products that either go through accelerated approval or have less definitive evidence at the time of approval is the feeling that there are inadequate tools to ensure that the additional evidence is going to be generated rapidly. And by the way, just as many of you have probably followed in the kind of on the devices side, there was a regulation that was put forward in the last administration, withdrawn in this administration, called Medicare Coverage of Innovative Technologies, which essentially would have meant that breakthrough devices and diagnostics approved by the FDA would automatically get CMS coverage, national coverage, for 4 years. And the idea was that in those 4 years, some additional evidence would be developed to ensure that, all of the questions had been answered that weren't available from the initial approval. And eventually that was rescinded because there was nothing in the regulation that would make it obligatory to actually conduct those additional studies in the 4 years. And I think the Medicare policymakers felt like, well, once the coverage was provided, where's the additional incentive to conduct the studies? An example of, I think, where this, has worked well with Medicare, and it's using the authority that I mentioned, coverage with evidence development. In the case of transcatheter aortic valve replacement, where there was a national registry through the National Cardiovascular Data Registries. In PET scanning and oncology, there was created a national registry to look at results and changes in patient management. And in those cases, the Medicare policy to require some kind of organized infrastructure to collect data, at least create an environment in which there was, an incentive or a requirement to actually build an infrastructure to systematically collect data. I think, my concern is, as I said before, that that kind of infrastructure requires substantial investment. Therefore, it's only been possible in the context of Medicare policy to do it for extremely expensive technologies. And there's lots of innovative technologies where the business case just wouldn't be adequate. And that's where I think, Rob, the article that you wrote in 2016 in the New England Journal about, the need for a more robust, broad infrastructure so that for data collection would enable Medicare and other payers to be much more confident that, the uncertainty would be addressed in a timely fashion.
So if there was a shorter path, what is the industry willing to do during this period of accelerated approval, maybe to spark this? I want to turn to Hal and Michelle. Should there be a period of time in which your drugs can get out to the market more quickly, and there is a temporary or particular, like a lower price, but it's still covered and you can use a different part of your business to cover it? Is that the right thing, or is there too much fear associated with that to move it forward, where you would get 3 years of advance, but during the period of the registry, it might be you would adjust the price until you have more robust data, and then the price can adjust based on what the real results are. Michelle, what do you think? Then I'll go to Hal.
Yeah, well, I think everything is on the table. Often in these conversations, there's the sense that the companies aren't necessarily in a hurry to get this data. And actually, companies really want the data. They want to be able to iterate their innovations. They want to be able to make the business case and the case to clinicians that this is a drug or a product that is going to make a substantial improvement for patients. But I think we need to come together. I mean, Rob mentioned the recovery trial and the fact that we don't necessarily have the infrastructure in the US to quickly knit together our system, our hodgepodge system of different clinical entities to try to collect more homologous data across them. So this is going to take CMS, it's going to take private payers, it's going to take FDA, and it's going to take industry to all come forward and step to the plate and figure out what is a more pragmatic way to get this data faster, cheaper, with less of a burden on patients so that we can get to the answer as soon as possible.
Hal?
Yeah, I mean, just to back up to the comment I made about real world evidence, I couldn't agree more that I was just more advocating for randomized controlled trials, and I think all randomized controlled trials in the extreme, but the goal should be that they reflect the epidemiology of the disease and therefore be real world. And to the extent that fails, yes, that's just a failure of the randomization and the system to enroll the patients. But all randomized trials, I think, should reflect the community setting. And what I was really referring to is that there's been a fair amount of push towards doing more observational studies and concluding from them that the drug works when you compare it to untreated patients who have, and we can use all these sophisticated techniques that I spent a decade of my life thinking about how to control for that, but I'm just not as confident, having seen for the next 20 years after doing that, how many times that fails. So I just think given that these drugs, when they're approved, are going to be used for a long, long time, that we got to get it right, and skimping on the randomization and understanding efficacy and effectiveness, but it is critical. So apologies if the real world was a sort of more observationally oriented comment, which is great for safety, by the way, but I just meant for conversion. I think the industry is highly incentivized already, and I don't know, I mean, there's always ways to make it more exciting. There could be better infrastructure to ensure that the randomized confirmatory trials are started earlier. Julia, to your point, it's terrific, and I've been associated with several where the randomized trials were even completely enrolled, some where they've been started. But the challenge for many small companies in particular are that they have their phase 2 data that just is much more impressive than they expected, and they could sit on it for 3 years, waiting for the phase 3 to enroll and maybe even have events. But that sort of detracts. So I think there are going to be times when you certainly it should be designed and maybe ideally even started. But I think it's going to be hard for companies to decide to initiate the confirmatory trials before unblinding their surrogate trials, because most of the time they probably won't be robust enough to even warrant it. 90% of drugs that enter the clinic fail. So it's a bit of a risk to start your confirmatory trial before seeing the results, and the longer you wait, the less valuable accelerated approval is. So I think that the bottom line is, if there was more effort between companies in a pre-competitive way to define the utility of these surrogates, to get the FDA and everybody on board that they are viable and would lead to accelerated approval. For example, maybe MRD and myeloma is what I'm thinking about recently. If there's ways of confirming that this is something useful, we can keep generating more and more data on the surrogate to give everybody even more confidence to the point where we're ready to use it. And I think then when the data shows that a new drug is more effective as a result of this surrogate, you can initiate the program. And I think there'd be a lot of interest on industry's part to collaborate with both the globe, because I do think we could use more effort ex-US in converting these in the trials, because the equipoise is there, as I mentioned earlier, but also any kind of infrastructure that the CMS or the FDA or the global academic community, if everyone could speed up the process of conversion, I think that would be incredibly important, because again, while there's only been, I guess, 80%, I didn't realize it was that low. There's going to probably be more as we become more aggressive at using this. And so I think it's going to be really critical to get these things done in a timely manner for a reasonable cost. So I think all the help could incentivize that.
There's a huge opportunity here, I think. And right now we have every company is on their own to generate the data, or any specialty society is on their own. And every time we do it all over again. We start it up and we're building the soccer stadium once and then tearing it down and starting again. So Congresswoman Eshoo, this is a quick round before I go to the audience for a question or two. If we built an infrastructure to make it easy to generate this data, where should it reside? Who should own it? I think that is actually the biggest problem. Where is the unbiased place to make it possible to have this data?
Well, I think that it's number one. It's absolutely essential to keep innovating ways to improve the efficiency of the overall system. Now, your leadership on one source project stands out. There has to be interoperability from our electronic systems. I think that's paramount for streamlining clinical investigations, generating confirmatory evidence, especially for life-threatening and debilitating diseases. Now, there's the question of tying data collection as an essential ingredient to making the system work. And I think that we need to answer that. Should there be financial incentives for that? Money can be a very effective motivator in all of our systems. So the High Tech Act created financial incentives for doctors and and hospitals to adopt electronic records. I think it was back in 2009. Today, there's nearly 90% of office-based physicians have adopted a certified electronic health record system. It's more than double than previous to that legislation. So it might be helpful to tie payments to data collection for drugs with accelerated approval to move the field forward faster and save more lives. I have to tell you that in all of these areas, I'm extraordinarily cautious because I don't know what you know. You have to be instructive to us. We certainly hear from the private sector about what problems they have, within our systems, whether it's FDA approval, whether many think that, or tell me that when they go to, it goes over to CMS, especially for devices, that it's a graveyard. But for payments, for reimbursement, everyone, once they have their project approved, or their device or their drug approved, they want to be in the game by being reimbursed. So in each one of these systems, I am very, and I think all members are, with the exception of doctor members, but I often wonder why doctors want to come to Congress. I would think that their practice is more gratifying and satisfying. We really are very dependent on solid, scientific, real-life information coming from each of you. Because God help the patients, God help all of us if we end up approving or putting in place systems that are not effective and can be damaging to the public. So these are really very, very delicate areas. I hope what I'm saying makes sense to you.
It does.
You're speaking a different language than members speak.
Yes.
So
so it's really interesting. And so one of the problems, of course, is that every electronic record is its own electronic record and there's no interconnectivity. And that's one of the problems to solve. So I'm going to ask a yes or no question so we have time for at least one audience question. Should the data be that we gather, should we create a more central, organized, replicable system, or should we leave it to each company and each specialty society to generate the data? Sean? One word.
I think we need a more holistic system. I know that wasn't one word, but I couldn't figure out this.
Good enough. Julia?
Yes, collaboration is always good and encouraged.
Michelle?
Or centralized, for sure.
Hal?
Yeah, I'll be controversial and say I think it should be centralized outside of industry.
Outside of industry. Okay. Rob, you can comment or not.
I mean, this one's my whole history. It needs to be coordinated. It needs to be coordinated centrally. And just look at our vaccine effort in terms of science and product development compared to everything else that we've done. It is centrally coordinated and driven.
Yeah.
And but it doesn't mean that it's monolithic and unilateral.
Correct. Yeah. So that's where some of the innovation, we'll be talking to you about this. So there's so many great questions. I'm sorry we don't have 2 hours for this panel. Let me just pick one here that says, how is the FDA working to create harmonization across the different review groups to catch other indications up with oncology and utilizing the accelerated approval pathway? So Julia, then I'll go to you.
Sure. Well, I think oncology is unique in a number of ways, and that's why it's really been successful with accelerated approval. One, the disease, of course, is serious and life-threatening across the spectrum. Realizing that definitely goes into many other non-oncologic areas, but that's one aspect where oncology has been successful, but certainly also goes into other areas. The other is that our drugs. There's really been an innovation over the last decade of targeted therapies due to precision oncology and understanding of the science, really bringing that science forward. And then the third is that we have the use of response rate as an endpoint. Our early endpoints are relatively more understood or perhaps common across many oncology indications versus perhaps other areas where there's more nuances across. And so I think, I know FDA is working on that early endpoint piece across other non-oncology areas. And certainly there is much drug development interest as well outside of oncology, which I think will catch up the other groups.
So there's so many questions. Maybe Rob, maybe a comment on rare diseases. So where there are so few patients and there is a lot of innovation in science, what's the thinking on setting up these kinds of registries? I think that's sort of already in process. And maybe we can ask Michelle about the right incentives for industry.
Yeah, I mean, there are several rare disease programs that include, development of natural history cohorts and registries, and accelerated approval types are the norm, not the exception. But it's even more magnified now that we realize we have people who are going to be alive for decades who weren't alive at all before, with treatments that have effects for a lifetime. We have to have a system that measures what's happening. And one other point that I know in many years of discussing things with Hal keeps coming up is once you have several effective treatments for a disease, then you're right in the same ballgame as the more traditional diseases, because the last thing you want to do is to have someone jump at something new because they think it might be great and fail. I wanted to say Eshoo, but I realized that would have been a play on words because of names here in the panel. But you don't want them to not use therapies that are proven to be effective and are less glamorous because they're now generic and inexpensive.
So, Michelle, what about industry and sort of providing? Do you think there's sufficient incentive to develop treatments for less common diseases today?
Well, we're certainly in a better place today than we were 10 or 15 years ago. We're seeing an explosion of interest and progress in the rare disease space, but there can always be more. There needs to be more. Julia mentioned targeted diseases, and I think both when it comes to the rare disease space and the highly targeted therapy space, patients become the most precious limited resource in terms of clinical studies, and that gives us even more of a need for a more centralized, coordinated approach to studying compounds in this space.
So another comment, the opening remarks noted off target of cell gene therapy, CRISPR editing. There are lots of existing biomedical research evidence not being used that could help improve the understanding of target molecular traits and pattern behavior. How do we more efficiently generate new surrogate endpoints? And how should that be built into trials? I see Hal, you shaking your head, so I'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, it seems pretty obvious to me that, and CRISPR is just an example, that when you look at the incredible explosion in our understanding of biology through advances in science, and more importantly, in my opinion, the incredible advances, exponential advances in technology, that the possibilities for patients over the next decade or 2 decades is going to, I think, be way more impressive in terms of innovations that help patients than we've ever seen. And so I think the idea of understanding the biology to get to better surrogates that are more likely to be in the causal pathway so that the list increases and we get more confident with accelerated approvals beyond oncology, to Julia's point about response rate being so useful. We need a response rate equivalent for all the important diseases. Some have them, as you talked about, rare diseases and enzyme replacement and things like that are pretty robust surrogate. I mean, but we need them for many more diseases so that we can take advantage of all these exciting scientific and technological breakthroughs. And so I couldn't agree more. And I think that analogous to collecting data to enable this, I think, again, there needs to be a lot more pre-competitive collaborations between industry and academia and government to ensure all the data generated is actually coalesced in a way that we can see signals that we couldn't see in any given study.
I noticed that Rob brought up the point about the lack of equipoise, or other people did. So once you've got everything announced and moved forward, should we be thinking more about building in, if you pass a certain point of the data, you continue to gather it before stopping and starting, that have your trials with a built-in ability to keep going so that you're not wasting your time and you're not getting to the point where you can't ask the question. I notice there's a point of like, we have to use ex-US data. Well, why is that necessary? Can we do it a better way? Some quick answer. Who wants to take that one on?
I'll make a comment, Laura, just because you and I've talked about this. I think the I Spy mode of looking at data and modifying based in a blinded way, but using machines and having Bayesian, Don Barry-esque ways of ensuring you're optimal in your treatment decisions for patients and making smart decisions is something that should be incorporated into all trials whenever possible.
All right, we're going to finish our panel with a lightning round here. So let's be optimistic. We're optimistic because of new leadership and our current leadership at the FDA. I know that, there wouldn't be trials like the I Spy trial if it weren't for people like Janet Woodcock, who really made it possible to try new approaches. Once there's confidence in both an early endpoint and a system for generating evidence, what is the biggest and most positive change that we could imagine over the next 5 years? And I'm going to ask each one of you. Rob, why don't you start?
I think the biggest change is a legislative framework that stimulates all the elements that we've talked about here to work together to get this done. This thinking goes back to 1970. This is not new thinking. Just the science has evolved and the computation has evolved, but the incentives are not aligned. I don't want to say I didn't appreciate Hal and Michelle's comments about industry, but Hal's comment about small companies and the investment that it takes to accelerate this versus using marketing once you're on the market. I can tell you, this plays out every day, and unless we have teeth in this, it's not going to work.
Michelle.
Well, I would hope that we would continue to evolve and remember about how important accelerated approval is. And it's interesting to contrast how we use accelerated approval in the US and how they use it in China, where they're actually trying to get 3 to 5 compounds through accelerated approval as quickly as possible, and then out into general use where they can compete for efficacy and cost, and then use that to export around the world. So while we've focused on a very US-centric view of accelerated approval, we also have to have a global view. And maybe that's the most important element to add going forward.
Great. Julia?
I think the accelerated approval program will continue to be an incredible tool for us, bringing therapies to patients years earlier. And for us, greater assurance of timely confirmatory trial completion by that early agreement I talked about with the company on the overall development plan, including even agreement on potential confirmatory metrics to have accomplished at the time of the accelerated approval action, would really allow for greater confidence in drug approval using the accelerated approval pathway.
Sean?
Yeah, as part of this legislative framework that Rob mentioned, I'll make a specific suggestion that an Office of a Chief Scientist be created at CMS, and that person coordinate with the Office of the Chief Scientist at FDA to come up with a paradigm for accelerated approval, policy, evidence generation, and a mechanism to actually, for the two agencies to have dialogue prior to accelerated approvals being finalized to talk about evidence generation plans.
Great. Hal?
Yeah, I agree with Rob. Let me just add one thing to it, or just to double click on it. I think that whatever legislative framework or paradigm is inserted, really think hard about how every group has skin in the game and is incentivized with the right food pellets. Because if you're If you're sitting there waiting for your confirmatory trial to unblind, and it's really good when it's delayed because it's continuing to be on the market, the food pellets aren't in the right place. So put them in a place where everybody's incentivized to accelerate approvals to get to patients faster with innovative science, but at the same time, incentivized to quickly figure out whether you made a smart decision that was wrong or a smart decision that was right.
Well, Anna, all eyes point to you. You apparently are the linchpin for all of this. So what do you think is the most important thing to achieve?
This is music to my ears, and I'm taking notes as you all are speaking for the legislative opportunities. I think that, these very effective pathways for approval, we have to keep refining. We have to keep refining, knowing that the public is somewhat suspect of fast approvals because they think that something was left out, therefore the efficacy is not what it should be. We always have to be mindful of that. I'm also mindful of how costly it is in the private sector to develop these breakthroughs, whether it's a drug, whether it's a medical device, and we need to be sensitive about that. I don't want to see something that is so promising for a cure or for moving something forward to deal with the disease that it doesn't come forward because the regulatory process outstrips the financial ability in the private sector to do what needs to be done. So I think that there needs to be tighter coordination. I really do. And I really look forward to Dr. Califf coming to FDA, that leadership. Peter Marks is absolutely exceptional, and the whole country should really genuflect for people that have brought us through one of the most trying times that we're still going through. So thank you for having me here. I've learned from you, and I hope that what you all are doing, that you will find a way to bring that information to me as the chair of the Health Subcommittee.
We will take that as our task.
When we get together at these conferences, and I think that there needs to be even more follow-up with us because it takes each one to make the changes and the accomplishments for the people that we're so privileged to either care for or to represent. So thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you, Congresswoman Eshoo. I want to take this opportunity to say that so appreciated this dialogue, so many great ideas, and I will certainly take it upon myself to make sure that we put all of this together and bring something more comprehensive to you. And to remember that you have to start, you work on it, you'll find things that don't work and you can always adjust it. But it's important to get started in this direction. With that, I want to thank everybody on the panel for just an incredible, for their incredible contribution. So thanks everyone so much.